Good morning and welcome to Armanino's SOX Annual Update webinar. Today we're going to be talking about working to stay ahead of the compliance curve. And before we get started with the presentation, I just want to remind you how to use your webinar pane. You can use the orange arrow, click on that to optimize the pane, and you can enter a question at any time throughout the webinar for our staff. We will answer those questions at the end as time allows. To minimize that webinar pane, you can click on the orange arrow again. Also, you want to be sure to select the correct audio settings. So if you're calling in on your telephone, please click the telephone button. If you're using your computer's mic and speakers, use that. If you have the wrong setting selected, you will get an echo sound. Today's webinar offers California CE. So in order to qualify for that, you need to use your personal computer, no PDAs, and log in with your own information and a unique URL. You must be logged into our online software for at least 50 consecutive minutes within the scheduled time frame of the webinar. You need to actively respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, and you need to complete the evaluation survey at the end of the webinar. We will email you your certificate for CE within 3 days after the webinar. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters. First we have Jeremy Suarski, who heads up our governance, risk, and compliance practice. Jeremy's got over 15 years of experience. He's led over 450 successful SOX and internal audit engagements. And he focuses on process optimization, automation, and information security. Our next presenter is Sean Batchelor. Sean's a manager in our financial assurance practice, and he has 8 years of public accounting and consulting experience. He focuses on technology industry clients, and he partners with clients to deliver business-focused SOX solutions. Our last presenter is Greg Mitchell. Greg has 9 years of public accounting and consulting experience. He's worked 3 years in industry. He also focuses on technology industry clients. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy.
Excellent. Thanks, Marion. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your morning to spend an hour with us and get hopefully some good nuggets on what you can do to work to stay ahead of the compliance curve. As I'm sure many of you are aware, over the last 18 to 24 months, it's been a very dynamic SOX and internal controls environment, really in the wake of Staff Alert 11, bringing about quite a few changes for how detailed companies need to be in the documentation of and performance of their internal controls. So what we're going to walk through today is we're going to give you an update on what the current state of SOX compliance is based on what we're seeing in the market within our existing client base, as well as what we're seeing based on the PCAOB inspection reports. We're going to focus on some of the areas where you can be proactive and take measures to get ahead of the curve and really work to be one step ahead of emerging regulations and ultimately one step ahead of your external auditors. And then last but not least, we're going to shake the magic 8 ball, peer into the crystal ball, read the tea leaves, whatever cliche you'd like to pick. And we're going to look at what we think are some areas where we're going to continue to see additional focus and additionally tap into some areas that may be additional value add beyond SOX compliance. So what does that translate to in terms of the overview for today's presentation? We're going to talk about the aftermath of Staff Alert 11, what changes have been made, what are the areas where companies continue to see challenges now a little over a year later. What are the top areas of focus? We're going to talk about how tax controls continue to evolve, how COSO 13 has been focused on over the past year, and where additional focus needs to continue. We're going to talk about a couple new ASUs, and then as I mentioned, peering around the corner and thinking about what is next. And with that, let's go ahead and pick up where we left off. If you recall, we did a similar update last year, and really that it was in response to Staff Alert 11. And if you recall, Staff Alert 11 was an update issued by the PCAOB in late 2013. And really the best analogy I can give for it is, for those of you on the line that know me and know me well, you know that I'm an absolute nut for everything, all things aviation, so it wouldn't be a webinar without me having some type of analogy. The best analogy for what really the PCAOB presented is what's happening in the airline industry as well. In the wake of the Asiana crash at SFO, the FAA released a report that effectively said pilots had become too dependent on on autopilot, and that's partially what contributed to the crash at SFO. And having friends who are pilots, it's interesting to note that most modern airplanes can land themselves. Pilots don't have to have their hands on the stick at all. So that analogy really translates to what was going on in the field of internal controls. If you look at the way that controls were performed year over year, it was a lot of, well, if it's not broke, don't fix it. If it was working last year, then let's do it again this year. Let's not dig in deeper. Let's not reevaluate risk. Let's not make sure that we have robust documentation around our MRCs. So you could really see that it was almost as though we were on autopilot and being too reliant on something doing the work for us, instead of really looking at each year's individual audit and looking at how it stands alone and determining what course of action we need to adjust to ensure that we're aligning with that. As we look at that, you could really translate that then into something that's very methodology specific. This is the methodology that Armanino applies in the planning and performance of a SOX audit, and really sort of pre-Staff Alert 11, what it ultimately focused on was, and where we spent the bulk of our time, was in the middle of the methodology, focusing on delivery, which was primarily testing. And what Staff Alert 11 really pushed companies to do, including Armanino as a service provider, was to take a step back and look at what is the more holistic approach to this. Are we assessing risk at the right level? Are we designing controls at the right level of precision? Are we documenting them appropriately? Are we testing them appropriately? Do we have the right sampling methodologies, etc.? Are we assessing deficiencies? Really what it forced companies and service providers to do, and in turn external auditors, is to take a more holistic look at how are you evaluating a sort of soup to nuts approach to internal controls over financial reporting. And really the key takeaway that we shared last year, which is something that I continue to impress upon all of the clients that I work with, and it was a quote from a U.S. Rear Admiral: the most damaging phrase in the language is, "It's always been done that way." And my staff recognize that one way to get on my bad side very quickly is to, when I give them review comments, come back and say, well, that's how we did it last year. We need to be thinking through these things on a day-to-day basis, and clients need to be doing the same thing. Companies need to be doing the same thing. Thinking about, in a very critical way, what is their business doing, what are those risks, and how do we mitigate those and evidence that risk mitigation in the most appropriate way. And falling into this trap of saying, well, it's always been done that way, really is going to be setting yourself up for failure in the long term. All right, so let's go ahead and hit the pause button momentarily, and let's kick off with our first polling question.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. So our first question today is, have you updated processes to account for changes brought about by Staff Alert number 11? Again, we do need you to respond to at least 75% of these polling questions in order to earn your CE. And we will give you time to enter in your responses here. And not sure is a perfectly valid answer, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. If you're a little bit further removed from the details, or if you're unsure of why you've been making updates, not sure is perfectly acceptable.
Okay, great. And with that, we will close the polling question.
And let's see what we had. Momentarily here, we'll have the results up. Perfect. This is actually kind of interesting for me. I personally thought that we would see more yes responses. I will tell you, in the client base that we service, and we're in and out of between 100 to 120 companies a year, this really has brought about pretty significant changes in many areas. The aftermath of Staff Alert 11, and we talked about some of those last year around MRCs and completeness of reports and things like that. And we're going to talk about a few more today. So I'm a little surprised that that's not higher. That being said, if the unsure bucket were to roll up into yeses, upon further investigation, I think that would probably be a little more in line with my expectations. Again, simply looking at what we're seeing in our client base as well. Greg or Sean, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really think that is pretty consistent to what we're seeing out there. Probably half and half have adopted some of the deficiency items from Staff Alert 11, built good remediation plans. So
good.
Seeing some good progress there.
Fantastic. Good. Well, let's dig back in here. We talked about the highlights of kind of what we focused on last year. Very early after Staff Alert 11 came out. We're sitting here a year later, And I think it's a good point to kind of turn the discussion to what are some of those other emerging areas. So Greg, we'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks Jeremy. Really nice overview. So it's important to note that what we cover today, it's not a product of new regulation, but rather this further spotlight being placed on internal controls over financial reporting, or ICFR. This was evident, as Jeremy discussed, through Staff Alert 11, issued just over a year ago, and even more evident based on results of some of our current PCAOB inspections. So to refresh your memory, the Public Accounting Oversight Board, PCAOB, issued Staff Audit Practice Alert number 11 in October 2013. The Office of the Chief Auditor issued this practice alert in light of a significant number of deficiencies observed by the PCAOB staff relating to audits of internal controls over financial reporting. This alert was issued to highlight new emerging and other noteworthy circumstances that may affect how auditors conduct audits under the existing requirements of board standards. And it gave rise to some of the specific areas where further attention was warranted based on these inspections performed over the last 3 years. As reflected on the slides, there were 6 primary focus areas. The first being assessing risk of material misstatement. Second is selecting controls to test, testing management review controls, or MRCs, IT considerations including system-generated reports, roll forward of controls tested at interim date, and analysis of control deficiencies. So now a year later, while we're still keeping these focus areas on top of mind, we're looking to our most recent PCAOB inspection reports to identify other areas for improvement. So in the wake of Staff Alert 11, the PCAOB was continuing to perform audit inspections. In 2013, the PCAOB conducted inspections of portions of audits performed by various public accounting firms and issued these inspection results throughout 2014. As a result of these inspections, the PCAOB identified audit deficiencies that were of such significance where it appeared the audit firm had not obtained sufficient appropriate audit evidence to support its opinion over whether the issuer had maintained this effective internal control over financial reporting. We reviewed 7 of these inspection reports, noting a total of 235 audits were inspected. So what did we find? Of the 235 audits, 70 issuers were identified as having audit deficiencies of significance, as I previously described. That's 30%. 30% of ICFR opinions issued without sufficient evidence to support the opinion. This percentage is quite alarming. It is worth noting, however, that Staff Alert came out in late 2013, so if an inspection was conducted prior to the issuance of this alert, this could be cause for some of the similar findings identified.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's just a really key thing to highlight is, as organizations, as external audit firms that are evaluated by the PCAOB turn their focus to updating quality control procedures, methodologies, et cetera, I think, as we sit here a year from now, as we're doing this update in 2016, looking back at 2015, I think, assuming that the response has been appropriate, that's where we're really going to start to see some traction and movement to where these PCAOB inspection reports will have fewer and fewer comments regarding internal controls over financial reporting. But to Greg's point, still to have 30% with issues is still pretty significant and in large part really in alignment with what we saw in Staff Alert 11.
Absolutely. So next we want to jump into, what were the areas with the greatest issues? The first here that rose to the top was validating completeness and accuracy. The PCAOB noted there was a consistent lack of sufficient validation over the completeness and accuracy of certain populations and listings utilized in control testing. The second area was this over-reliance on ITGCs and system reports, or IPE, information provided by the entity, which Jeremy will be touching on further later in the presentation. And still a big area for opportunity is surrounding management review controls. We noted that these type of controls are continuing to operate as sort of this check-the-box exercise with solely a signature and date as evidence of review and approval. So as a reminder, greater attention now needs to be placed on attributes of the review, which need to be clearly documented to evidence the review was adequately performed to address the potential risk. The next area here is remediation approach. The PCAOB cited that in many instances, the approach to remediating control deficiencies was simply just not sufficient. Next area, reliance on inquiry. The important item here is that we need to remember that procedures used to validate the appropriate design and operating effectiveness need to include this mix of inquiry of appropriate personnel, observation of the company's operations, and then also inspection of relevant documentation. As noted, inquiry alone does not provide sufficient evidence to support a conclusion about the effectiveness of internal control. And then finally, which was a bit surprising, rose to one of the top items, was sampling methodologies. This was an area where the PCAOB felt further attention is needed. There were multiple references to the insufficiency of sample sizes used to test certain controls, especially in instances where deficiencies were identified in previous control testing. So reflecting on these inspection results, we'd like to focus on a few specific areas where we feel further investment is warranted. These areas include adoption of COSO 2013, information provided by the entity, development of tax controls, and then one specific emerging audit standard regarding the disclosure of uncertainties about an entity's ability to continue as going concern. So we'll discuss these items further in the following slides. But first, let's do our second polling question.
Thank you, Greg. All right. So our second polling question is, has your company aligned to the COSO 2013 framework? Again, your responses are either yes, no, or not sure. And we do require your responses in order to be able to provide you with your CE certificate after this webinar. So we're going to keep the polling question open for a little while longer. Okay, we're going to give you just about 5 more seconds to put in your response, and then we will move to close the poll. Okay, thank you. And the results are 76% of you have aligned your company to the COSO 2013 framework, so that's good news.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's good news. Good morning, everyone. This is Sean. 76% have already adopted. That's, I would say, a little surprising. Most of our clients had, in fact, early adopted, but according to a national survey, which I'll go over momentarily, nationwide, it's not nearly as high. All right, so as you've hopefully heard by now, there was an update to the original COSO framework, which was published back in May of 2013. In fact, Jeremy and myself, we delivered a webinar on this back in, early 2014, about a year ago. So we're not going to go too deep into the specifics of the updated framework during this webinar. We simply don't have the time, but you can actually check out a recording of that webinar on our firm website. So note that after December 15th, 2014, old COSO was officially considered superseded by the 2013 edition, so just a few months ago. So here we are coming out of the first whole year of the updated framework, and we wanted to share some of our findings. But before we jump into our findings, I wanted to provide a very high-level synopsis of the changes for those of you who are less familiar or who may have missed out on our webinar last year. The original 5 components of the COSO framework, seen here on the left, they remain the exact same as the original 1992 framework. The updated framework sets out 17 principles, seen here on the right, representing the fundamental concepts associated with each component. Because these principles are drawn directly from the components, an entity can achieve effective internal control by applying all of these principles. It should be noted, however, that each principle is suitable to all entities. All principles are presumed relevant, except for in rare situations where management determines that a principle is not relevant. But this is really rare. I actually haven't come across this yet. So you should assume that all 17 of these principles, that they have to be mapped to a key control, specifically to both direct and indirect ELCs, or entity-level controls. Now, during the mapping, coming out of the mapping exercise, if you find that there is a gap where a control needs to be designed to address a principle, the updated framework, it includes 75 points of focus to help you aid in control design. But please note that not every point of focus needs to exist for effective internal control. They're simply there as a guide to help aid in control design. So over the past full year the new frameworks have been around, we found that the vast majority of our clients chose to early adopt. And that was reflected in the recent polling question that we just went over. But it's not necessarily true industry-wide. According to a fairly recent survey from a global consulting firm titled Keeping Pace with SOX Compliance, COSO, COS, and the PCAOB, 48% of the 650 executives and professionals surveyed reported that their organization had not yet applied the new framework to their key controls as of the first quarter of 2014. So if you've not early adopted, you're not alone, but you will quickly soon be forced to adopt. Now, for our clients that had early adopted, we as SOX providers, we worked closely with both management as well as the external auditors to perform and document a detailed mapping exercise, ensuring that all principles were covered. We noticed that the various external firms, they all have their own unique COSO evaluation templates. Some we found were in Excel, some were in Word format, some include and directly reference all 75 points of focus, which I personally like. Others do not and simply just reference the 17 principles. But in all cases we've seen additional controls were needed to be designed to cover gaps.
And Sean, one thing that's interesting to note here as well, just given our experience over the last year with COSO, I think a lot of internal control professionals, ourselves included, came into 2014 expecting alignment with COSO to be a relatively straightforward and somewhat innocuous exercise. If you look at the way that the framework was previously designed, these points of focus and the principles were there in the 92 framework. They were just called out in a little more explicit detail. And to Sean's point, while COSO is very explicit that you do not need to have all 75 points of focus for the principles to be in place and operating, the thing that we found though is interpretation of this varies widely, shall we say. In many cases, we work with clients, and based on guidance and input from their external auditors, et cetera, we actually had to work with management to fill gaps for all 75 points of focus and show very explicitly how each one not only had been considered, but how a control was designed and implemented for each of those. So really, really interesting to see how the interpretation in some respects sort of goes against the grain to what is explicitly called out in COSO. But as you sort of turn your focus and not only work to implement COSO, as well as on an ongoing basis for the 76% that already have done it, it's an exercise that you have to continually reevaluate. We talked about, we don't want to be on autopilot. We don't want to just say, hey, we did it last year, we're okay. Be thinking about how you're considering those points of focus, et cetera. And Sean is going to dig in, of course, into some areas where we really saw sort of the gotchas, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So wanted to go over some areas that we've commonly seen gaps arise, as Jeremy mentioned. So first off, Principle 4. Principle 4, this is a real common area that we've seen gaps pretty much across the board here. Principle 4, it reads, the organization demonstrates a commitment to attract, develop, and retain competent individuals in alignment with objectives. The good news is, in most cases, our clients had an established process in place. It just needed to be called out as a key control and subsequently tested. So within this principle, there were two primary points of focus that we found were typically missing and we needed to design a control. The first one, point of focus 2. This has to do with evaluating competence and addressing shortcomings. So what's that mean? Well, it really means, do you evaluate the need to use specialists? And so this is common, in tax. Do you outsource, to a tax provider? Or maybe technical accounting. Maybe you hire a consulting firm for some help with some complex technical accounting issues. So the control that we put in place doesn't have to be anything too fancy. It could read something along the lines of, the company periodically assesses the capabilities of staff and determines where outside assistance is needed. Now the other point of focus under Principle 4 is point of focus 4, and that reads, plans and prepares for succession. So this is something that a lot of companies, especially being in the talent-rich Bay Area, they haven't put too much thought into it, and if they have, they haven't formally documented a succession plan. And we're finding that that is something that needs to be done. So an example control activity description to fill this gap would be, the company has a documented succession plan for key operational and financial reporting roles that includes an identification process of potential candidates, training programs, and mentoring. The board of directors has effective oversight of the succession planning process. All right. So another area we've commonly seen gaps this year is Principle 14. Principle 14 reads, the organization internally communicates information, including objectives and responsibilities for internal control necessary to support the functioning of internal control. So that seems a little vague and nebulous, but what it basically comes down to is it's not good enough to rely on your SOX providers to review process documentation. Management and control owners, they need to be reviewing for continued accuracy and validity. And, this should be evidenced somehow, whether it's having them ultimately, on an annual basis sign off on the narratives, or it could even be evidenced, with an email. But we should be able to point to something that shows that the control owners, they themselves reviewed the process documentation on a regular basis, typically annually. So an example control can read something like, on an annual basis, global process owners review process narratives, flow charts if applicable, and risk and control matrices to confirm accuracy of their processes. Lastly, I wanted to go over another principle that we've commonly seen gaps, and that's Principle 8. Principle 8 reads, the organization considers the potential for fraud in assessing risk to the achievement of objectives. Now, we find that most companies do in fact perform and document a risk assessment of some kind, but what we found is that the assessment does not always cover specifically fraud, and it needs to. So an example control activity description would be the company conducts a comprehensive fraud risk assessment to identify the various ways that fraud and misconduct can occur. And this can be in several formats. It could be a questionnaire or even something more formal than that. But I want to point out that these are just a few of the areas we've seen gaps, not to say there have not been others. Most of our clients coming out of their first COSO 13 mapping exercise, they're seeing about an additional 5 to 10, even 10 plus controls in the ELC, entity level control area. But as mentioned, processes were typically in place. The companies just needed to get credit for what they're actually doing by designing controls, calling them out, and subsequently testing them.
Yeah, and on Principle 8 here, Sean, this one's really interesting to point out because, while you mentioned that most companies do risk assessment, fraud tends to be sort of the wild card in there. Companies consider it, they design controls around it, but it's rare that we see them actually calling it a fraud risk assessment. So in this space especially, any time that you can look to external resources to leverage for a framework that you can use around fraud risk assessment, et cetera, or any other key areas that you may see gaps, definitely recommend doing that. In this case, you can look to, I believe it's the ACFE, which is manages the Certified Fraud Examiner certification. They have resources you can leverage, whether it be the long form or short form of fraud assessment. Very, very good resources that you can then point back to as an industry-leading organization that you're leveraging their thought leadership in the performance of your specific fraud risk assessment. Very powerful to be able to demonstrate that to your external auditors to say, not only are we evaluating fraud risk, we're not sort of doing it on our own in a vacuum. We're leveraging best practices. We're leveraging industry-leading thought leadership. So really good opportunities to leverage some other external documents there and make this process a little bit easier and more robust in the process.
All right, so now we're going to turn it back to Jeremy to go over information provided by the entity.
Perfect. All right, thanks for that, Sean. IPE is a really, really fun area for someone like myself who's got an IT background. This is one that I love sinking my teeth into. It's been an area that continues to evolve and continues to cause challenges. Really, at a nutshell, it comes down to a control owner needing to ask themselves the following question: what have I done in the performance of this control to verify the reports I am relying on are in fact complete and accurate? How do I ensure there are no issues, that there is nothing either intentionally or inadvertently omitted? And that's a question a lot of control owners cannot answer very easily because they look at it as we have responsible parties in our IT environment, IT group that are ultimately responsible for running our system. So I would look to them, but the reality is as you dig into the source of these various reports, you could find issues, and it's your responsibility as the control owner to do this. In the past, this may have been something that teams like Armanino as a service provider would come in and help you with to substantively validate at a point in time that your reports are complete and accurate. It's just something really where the tide has shifted, though, and it is really incumbent on the control owner themselves to do this. So you might be sitting there saying, Jeremy, that's great. I know what reports I use. I know what system they come off of, but hey, I'm not an ERP expert. I'm not a systems expert, et cetera. Well, that's okay. We've got a 3-step process, and we have a supporting template that we'd be happy to share out. You'll have our contact information at the end of this presentation. Feel free to email any one of us, and we'll make sure you get it. It's really a 3-step process. So the first piece is validating the source. And really what it is a combination of IT and finance professionals sitting down together, and the finance professionals being the control owners, sitting down and stepping through what is the exact report that I'm leveraging for the performance of this control, and within that report, what is the specific data element I am using. You know, in some cases we've seen control owners leveraging these monumental reports, dozens of pages, you know, 15, 20 columns of data, you know, spilling across the page, and the reality is they ultimately rely on one total at the bottom of at the bottom of the report, something, you know, that summarizes the data. Well, if I'm only relying on one data element from that report, I don't need to validate every single piece of data. I simply need to validate that total represented on the report that is being relied upon is in fact complete and accurate. Well, the way you would then do that is then work with IT. So give them the input to say, here is the report, here's the system, here is the data element I'm relying on. Then IT has the inputs necessary to go leverage their expertise and dig into the stored procedures, to the database, to the SQL code, to whatever that information is, to be able to provide that assurance back to the control owner. And so that's significant. And that's something that if it has not been done holistically for your organization, really what needs to be done is a baseline exercise needs to be done for all reports that are being leveraged for internal controls over financial reporting. Then you can move into a rotational basis where those reports are re-baselined a minimum of every 3 years. And the way we commonly work with organizations to do that is do the baseline and then re-baseline about 30 to 40% of those reports on an ongoing basis every year. And we shoot to do that during a time frame when it's not quite as busy, sort of in the middle of the quarter, when you're not in the middle of monthly close, you're not in the middle of, you know, quarter-end financials and reporting and things like that. So that's the source. The second piece is you as the control owner have to document your interaction with that report. Well, what does that mean? It's not uncommon to take a report off of a system, take some piece of data, plug it into a spreadsheet, and then apply logic to it. Well, in the performance of those steps, how do we know, or how do you evidence that you input the right dates? If I'm looking for, hey, I need a report that shows a specific piece of data for the month of February, you know, how do we know, and what did you do to evidence that you input February 1st to February 28th or 29th, depending on the year, appropriately? If you then took data out of that report and plugged it into a spreadsheet, well, what evidence did you leave to show that you tied back to that source report, that the data you input was not fat-fingered or inadvertently deleted or had some erroneous logic applied to it? So that is ultimately what you then need to do is it's think of it almost as chain of custody. As you move from step to step, what are the breadcrumbs you're leaving to show that an individual with relevant skills, knowledge, and experience can then step in and re-perform that procedure following the evidence trail that you had left. And then last but not least, the evaluation piece, and that's really more incumbent on organizations such as Armanino, your service provider, your internal audit provider, et cetera. This is where we come through and evaluate how did you validate the source in the performance of the control, how did you evidence your interaction with the report, et cetera. And we would potentially dig into some of the mechanics of the spreadsheet as well. But really, if you were to apply this 3-step approach, it's really going to give you a very solid basis to show how you're approaching completeness and accuracy of reports. Now, the one thing I will say that this approach also relates to is, well, what about automation of movement of data between systems, interfaces, et cetera? This can be applied to those types of functions as well. If you look at data moving from maybe an operational, a manufacturing system back into the core ERP or vice versa, well, how do we know that data movement is complete and accurate? Well, ultimately, what we want to look at is the same process. Well, what is the data that's being moved, et cetera, et cetera? What about the interaction with that? How do we know if there's been an issue with it? What does IT do to monitor that, et cetera? And then from there, move into the evaluation. So the power behind this sort of 3-step approach is any of the evolving areas of generically called IPE, information provided by the entity, IT-related items that control owners rely on. This really applies to all of them, and you can apply the same logic to each one. So there's a lot of power in this process. Okay. And with that, let's shift gears to Eamon's busy season. We're all hopefully working on our income taxes. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about what we're seeing in relation to tax provisions and the relative controls we need to see.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeremy. Indeed, tax, everyone's favorite subject here. So as a result of recent PCAOB inspection findings, we are beginning to see auditors proposing an expansion of key controls within the tax cycle. In the past, typically a company may have about 5 controls or so within the tax cycle, and specifically one mega overarching control surrounding the review of the tax provision. But what we're finding is this really no longer flies. It's no longer acceptable. So now, instead of seeing one mega all-encompassing control surrounding the review of the provision, we're seeing it being kind of blown up and segmented into individual key controls over the specific review methodology of the different components within the tax provision. So basically replacing one key SOX control over the general review of the provision into numerous, specific, and very precise controls over different aspects of the provision itself. So instead of seeing about 5 or so controls, now we're commonly seeing 10 to even 15 controls within the tax cycle. Now, despite an increased testing burden, we actually believe this is a good change for a number of reasons, but primarily because if a small error is found within one aspect of the provision, the entire provision review control should not fail, which, as you know, would be considered a major deficiency. I mean, you're looking at either a significant deficiency or a material weakness. So the failure would be more isolated, and the failure has a greater chance of being mitigated by another compensating control. Furthermore, this exercise focuses, or forces management rather, to be more specific with what their review actually includes, leading to overall better documentation and better documentation of control precision. But first, let's jump into our next polling question.
We're just making sure that you're alert and with us here. So our next polling question is, how many total key controls do you currently have in your tax cycle? Is it A, 1 to 3, B, 4 to 6, C, 7 to 10, D, 11 or more, or E, not sure? And again, not sure is always a valid answer with our polling questions. And so we're going to leave it open for a few more seconds to ensure that you can all vote. And just a reminder that you should put in your response so that we can give you that continuing education credit. Okay, we're going to close the poll in just a couple of seconds here. Thank you for your participation. And the responses are?
Okay, well, surprisingly, the majority of you are unsure. I would recommend definitely taking a spin through your tax documentation to see where your company stands. But out of the remaining options, 4 to 6, that's exactly what I anticipated. And I would think that over the next year or so, you're going to see that number grow. All right, so let's dive in. What does this look like? Well, previously, what I mentioned, the overarching control, it may have read something along the lines of, on a quarterly basis, the controller and CFO, they review the tax provision workbook and corresponding memo as prepared by the third-party tax advisors. There's really multiple issues with this, including lack of defined mechanics. What's looked at as part of the review? What are the review steps? Also, there's lack of review precision. What thresholds are in place? What's considered an outlier? What's considered, an exception? And lastly, lack of follow-up process. What's done when an exception or an outlier is found? So now let's take a look at some of the individual controls that we've seen segmented out of this. First off, we're seeing a control around the review of the inputs and calculations contained within the provision itself. So this is, reviewing calculations, making sure they're clerically accurate, there's no broken formulas. This is making sure that the correct, final trial balance was the one that was in fact referenced. We're also seeing a specific control over review of the effective tax rate. We're seeing a control over the assumptions of the valuation allowance, another one over UTPs, and some other ones that you can see mentioned here. So you're really seeing this is kind of the 8 or so that I'm seeing blown out from that one pre-existing control that's really not up to standards. Now, one more thing I want to mention, because these are typically deemed management review controls, or MRCs, it's important that evidence of consideration of outliers be documented by the reviewer. So this is, as a reviewer, if you have follow-up questions, if something doesn't look right, document those. Put them in an email, send them off to the preparer, document them. Even handwritten notes are fine. But you need to be able to point to something that shows it reflects your review precision and that you followed up on things that just didn't look right. And if you're not finding any outliers, then it could be argued that the control is not precise enough. All right, the last topic I wanted to cover today was an ASU that was released the latter part of last year. It was released in August of 2014, and it's ASU 2014-15, Disclosure of Uncertainties about an Entity's Ability to Continue as a Going Concern. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but basically what it boils down to, this update transfers some of the burden of going concern evaluation from auditors to company management. So currently, under GAAP, and how GAAP is always read, is that the continuation of a reporting entity as a going concern is presumed unless the entity's liquidation becomes imminent. That's commonly referred to as the going concern basis of accounting. GAAP and federal securities law has always required that an auditor evaluate whether there is substantial doubt about an entity's ability to continue as a going concern for a reasonable period of time not to exceed 1 year. However, in the past, there's been no guidance in GAAP about management's responsibility to evaluate substantial doubt. So what's new here? Well, when preparing financial statements for each annual and interim reporting period, an entity's management should evaluate whether there are conditions or events considered in the aggregate that raise substantial doubt about the entity's ability to continue as a going concern within 1 year after the date the financial statements are issued. So let's get into the specifics here. Specifically, this ASU, the amendments contained within, well, number one, they provide a definition of the term substantial doubt. This was never clearly defined in the past. Also, this ASU, it requires, as I mentioned, an evaluation by management every reporting period, including interim periods. Number three, it also provides principles for considering the mitigating effect of management plans. So if management comes to the conclusion that there is substantial doubt about their ability to continue as a going concern, what plans are in place? And those plans, they have to be disclosed. Number four, it requires certain disclosures when substantial doubt is alleviated as a result of consideration of management's plans. This was what I just touched on. Number five, and this is the big one, it requires an express statement and other even more disclosures when substantial doubt is not alleviated. And lastly, it requires an assessment period for 1 year after the date of the financial statements are issued. So the big takeaways here, basically that a disclosure is needed whenever substantial doubt exists about an entity's ability to continue as a going concern, even if management has mitigating plans. And when substantial doubt is not alleviated by those plans, that's when additional disclosures and even an express statement is required. So what's the SOX impact? Is there a SOX impact? Well, what we anticipate, and in fact what we're going to be recommending to all of our clients, is that an ELC is designed to cover this. It's something likely that externals are going to end up requiring, and it doesn't need to be anything too fancy. It just needs to read on a quarterly basis. The controller prepares a documented going concern evaluation complete with analysis of the mitigating effect of management's plans as applicable. This evaluation is subsequently reviewed and approved by the CFO. So that's just an example of how a control could read to cover this ASU. Last things I want to mention, the amendments in this update, they apply to all entities, and they're actually effective for the annual periods ending after December 15th, 2016, and for annual and interim periods thereafter. I will note that early adoption is permitted, so beginning this year in 2015, you'll likely be hearing about this more from either your auditors or from your SOX providers.
That's a great update, Sean. Well, let's shift gears here. That's really a very, very good update on some of the things that we've seen over the last year. But as I mentioned in the intro, let's talk about some of the things that we think we're going to see more of a focus on, and really what you can do to get one step ahead, not only of your external auditors and kind of what these emerging compliance activities are, but also be thinking about where are some areas that you can improve and gain some efficiencies. So we're going to highlight here in the last 10 to 15 minutes of our presentation a couple of different things. Number one, how do you go about effectively remediating deficiencies? And I'll tell you, this is an area that a lot of organizations that we work with, they look at it from the perspective of assuming that deficiencies are not significant or material. To a certain degree, the remediation plan is try harder, as opposed to looking at really what broke down in the process. Where is improvement needed with technology or with process or with retraining of the resources, et cetera. We're also going to look at self-reporting and being very self-aware as an organization so you can proactively point out where you've got issues. We're going to talk about automation. And last but not least, we're also going to talk briefly about how we can leverage SOX as a springboard into a broader effort around ERM, or enterprise risk management. So let's dig in with remediating control deficiencies, Greg.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. So I'd like to touch a bit on the process for remediating control deficiencies, as we are seeing varying approaches across our client base. And this was a specific area the PCAOB pointed out in the recent inspections. So for those companies that don't already have a formal and consistent approach to effectively remediate control deficiencies, now is really the time to build one. So what are the best steps to take? If a control has been classified as deficient either by management or by an auditor, we recommend an initial meeting is held to discuss and investigate root cause. Next, we suggest a formal corrective action plan is created by the relevant control and process owners to document the approach to remediation and establish an anticipated target date for completion of the remediation process. The remediation procedures performed should be well documented by detailing the validation steps taken to ensure the issue is resolved and the control is now operating effectively. We also recommend the completed corrective action be formally approved by the control owner, business process or application owner, and management. And then lastly, the effective control date should be established and communicated amongst the business back to the auditors in a timely fashion. This is also very important from the perspective of those testing the related controls to understand the effective dates, to plan, test strategies accordingly, and once you get into testing, to appropriately validate the control's design and operating effectiveness.
Okay, and our last polling question. Do you have a documented remediation process for control deficiencies? A, yes, B, no, C, not sure. So we'll give you a few seconds to fill this out. This is the last of our polling questions, so if you missed one earlier in the webinar, this is the chance to fill it out and make sure that you get your CE. And we will send you not only a recording of the webinar, a link to the recorded webinar and PowerPoint slides, but also your CE certificate within 3 days after today's presentation. Okay, and with that, we are going to close the poll. Thank you.
Excellent. So, yeah, the results are about consistent to what we anticipated. Good to see 44% of you out there are actually formalizing a corrective action plan process. For those that haven't, we definitely recommend this is an area where a more formalized approach can be taken. And for those unsure, we ask that maybe you refer back to our slides to think through a more formalized process. How do you start with root cause? How do you validate the appropriate operating effectiveness of the control, gain approval from management, and then ultimately test the control on the back end? Great. So on the flip side of remediating control deficiencies, how does your company perform at self-reporting control deficiencies? Have you self-reported deficiencies in the last year? This really goes beyond the common entity level control most organizations have in place related to whistleblower policies. Self-reporting deficiencies entails really not being afraid to raise your hand when issues are identified to help drive quick resolution. The earlier issues are raised and the quicker they are resolved, the less potential exposure to your company. This is both from a potential financial statement standpoint and then also ICFR perspective. Also, it's just good business. To continually identify process improvement opportunities is always a good thing. So I asked, does the culture of your company make employees feel comfortable about raising concerns about potential control deficiencies? If you hesitate on this question, it's time to start building a greater culture of control consciousness, where those with the courage to raise issues and really participate in the effective resolution are applauded.
Yeah, and this is an interesting one, because as we were planning for this webinar, it's one that Greg and I discussed at length. And if we reflect back to the previous slide where the remediation process begins by root cause analysis, digging in, and if you've done any type of work around ISO, especially 9001, around quality assurance, one of the things that it dictates as well is root cause analysis. And you always start with what are the possible root causes. You analyze those and ultimately work down to what is the right one. I will say, over the past 4 to 5 years, even with all of the sort of churn in the industry around internal controls, I would say the primary cause in most cases for control deficiencies is in many cases related to an individual not performing something at the appropriate frequency, level of detail, etc. But it comes back to an individual effectively not doing their job. Well, as you start to look at more robust deficiency analysis, it's going to facilitate this cultural change, or if done effectively, I should say, will facilitate this cultural change where control owners are going to be looking critically at their process and thinking about what they can change, and thinking about, before they provide evidence to the auditor, looking at it, effectively, it's, you've got the answers to the test before you have to go in and take it. Looking at that and saying, you know what, gosh, I found this issue. We're going to go ahead and remediate it by doing A, B, and C, and being able to provide that information before it even you sit down with the auditor, whether it be internal or external, it's very, very powerful. So let's shift gears here briefly then. One of the areas that, again, if you've worked with me in the past, you know that I'm very interested and very passionate about is looking at automation. How do we eliminate manual steps? How do we make this whole internal control thing just be an output of what you do on a day-to-day basis? Well, the challenge is, at the end of the day, when you look at systems and processes and how you facilitate processes through technology, let's take an ERP implementation for an example. You're moving off of an older, antiquated system that doesn't fully support your organizational needs. You're going to move on to a new one. The way you define most of what you need is to look at what are our key business processes. What is our month-end close? What is our external reporting process? What's our procure-to-pay process? Fixed assets, et cetera, et cetera. And in many cases, most organizations don't take a step back to say, hey, what about our governance requirements? What about our risk requirements, et cetera? Now, those are looked at from an implementation perspective. Did we test it? Do we have sign-off for go-live, et cetera? But what are the requirements around audit? Should we be looking at any type of enterprise application and saying, I want to have more robust audit trails. I want completeness and accuracy of reports to be easier, et cetera, et cetera. Well, focusing on these areas can help your audit process be more streamlined and sustainable. And really, there's also some ancillary products that sit around your core financial systems, your core operational systems, that are really going to help you automate a lot of areas. If you look at the financial close process, you look at products, like, Workiva, Flowcast, Blackline being one of the leaders in this space. Bringing leading class cloud technologies to your financial close process to, number one, help you manage it, give you more visibility into where you're at, and really help you drive some operational efficiencies. Same thing in account reconciliations. Blackline is a great product, and I will say, while I'm a big fan of it, we are not affiliated in any way with them as a firm. So, simply from what I've seen, it work very, very well with clients and provide very, very good operational benefits. Other things like control assurance. How do we centralize on a standard platform for multiple compliance efforts, whether it be regulatory compliance, government compliance, industry-specific compliance, whether it be FDA, et cetera. But how do we gain some efficiency? And last but not least, SEC reporting. Workiva being really one of the go-to products in that space, making the SEC reporting process very straightforward and very streamlined. So I would challenge you to look at your organization and do two things. Number one, determine how risk and governance can be part of your requirements process for every system. And then also look at what are some of these other systems that may be right on the fray of what you do day to day that could really facilitate and automate a lot of your processes, thereby saving you some time and expense in the process. And last but not least, let's spend a little bit of time talking about ERM.
Great. So I know we're throwing a lot of information at you today, but we want to touch on our last topic here regarding enterprise risk management. So looking beyond ICFR for a moment, we are noticing an important need for companies to be able to identify and convey all potential risks across the organization and manage them appropriately. SOX often establishes the foundation for risk and control However, we don't want to stop here. We recommend using your SOX program as a building block to develop a formal ERM program. So many benefits can be achieved in moving to an ERM program, which Jeremy is going to touch on a bit further.
Yeah, absolutely, and I love that graphic there. That's the Transbay Terminal in San Francisco. So next slide here. So why would you want to go beyond SOX? Well, there's a lot of things happening out there right now. There are many, many more risks to your business, whether it be hacking, with the anonymous mask there, very, very top of mind with Sony Pictures, and, at least 1 to 2 times a year there's a major data breach, whether it be Home Depot or Target, TJ Maxx, et cetera. Over the years, these have been major ones. You've got business strategy. What is it that your business strategy is over the next 2 to 3 years, and what could impede you from being successful? Movement to the cloud absolutely creates inherent risk because you're transferring that risk from something you directly manage in-house to managing that vendor and how they oversee it. So a lot of different areas of risk. And really, you may be looking at this saying, okay, how do we, Jeremy, give me the tools to take us from a financially focused risk program, and it's really in the name that we leverage for SOX, internal controls over financial reporting, relatively straightforward, very, very focused. Help me understand how we would go about doing this without boiling the ocean, because many organizations we work with look at this and say, gosh, that's a big business kind of thing. That's a Fortune 100 thing. I would challenge everybody, mid-market all the way up, can benefit from having a very tailored and focused ERM program that fits the size and maturity level of their business. And let's talk a little bit about how that might be put into motion.
Great. So at a high level, what is enterprise risk management? It's really just this common approach and framework to ensuring the strategic objectives of our companies are protected. So as Jeremy mentioned previously, these risks could be operational or financial in nature, or they could represent themselves as external factors, people-related issues. This really goes beyond ICFR, as we previously mentioned. ICFR would really just represent one element of this risk management program. We thought the COSO Cube is a great foundation for an ERM strategy, especially the areas related to event identification, risk assessment, and risk response. The Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, COSO, defines risk as the possibility that an event will occur and adversely affect the achievement of objectives. With that definition in mind, ERM really strives to first understand what are the inherent risks that exist in your organization. Next, your company must analyze risk mitigation activities that are currently in place to address these risks. Across our clients, we've seen various lines of defense put in place to assist with risk mitigation, including monitoring activities performed by various operational and quality assurance groups. Examples here might include metrics, data mining, self-testing, and other assessments. Another line of defense would be audits of processes performed by assurance groups such as internal audit. Internal audit would really be the second or third line of defense, with operations management being that first line. And then after understanding risk mitigation activities in place to defend against risks and taking into account your organization's risk appetite, the key to ERM is then understanding and evaluating what residual risk remains, ranking these risks according to likelihood of occurrence and potential impact, and then developing further mitigation techniques to address risks that are assessed at a higher level based on this criteria. Ultimately, this gives great perspective to management and leadership. A formal and effective ERM program can give leadership key perspective and insight on where risks lie across the organization and where focus should be prioritized. So if you haven't already done so yet, we highly suggest implementing an ERM program in your company.
That's a great update, Greg. And really the risk response piece is really one of the key values that comes out of ERM is inventorying what your risks are and then determining what your response is, whether you're, mitigating, accepting, et cetera. In conclusion, we're just about wrapped up here. You can see the areas that we covered. Unless you were completely asleep on the webinar today, you've got a very good feel for what these are. What I would challenge you to do is to take a critical look as you close out 2014 and move into your planning for 2015. Look at how you can embrace some of these things. Take a critical look at COSO and tax and IPE, thinking about new ASUs, et cetera, and then considering how do you move to a more value-add ERM type process. We are just about out of time here, and we did have a couple questions. What I will say to the individuals that submitted questions is, since we're out of time, myself or one of either Greg or Sean we will go ahead and reach out to you directly. Very, very good questions, and I think we can provide some insight on those. We'll reach out to you directly, so thank you for submitting those.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy and Sean and Greg. Great webinar. Our presenters' information is here on the screen, and again, we will reach out to you within 3 business days with your certificate of completion and a link to the recorded webinar so you can review the information provided. Thanks for joining Armanino today.